2. Is there a covenant of works? The Westminster Confession, one of the great documents of the Christian faith, has at one point been rightly criticized over the years. Its concept of a covenant of works is not only wrong, but shows a misunderstanding of the nature of the covenant. The key references to this covenant of works are 2. The first covenant made with man was a covenant of works, wherein life was promised to Adam and in him to his posterity, upon condition of perfect and personal obedience. 3. Man, by his fall, having made himself incapable of life by that covenant, the Lord was pleased to make a second, commonly called the covenant of grace, wherein he freely offereth unto sinners life and salvation by Jesus Christ, requiring of them faith in him, that they may be saved, and promising to give unto all those that are ordained unto life his Holy Spirit, to make them willing and able to believe. 1. God gave to Adam a law as a covenant of works, by which he bound him and all his posterity to personal, entire, exact and perpetual obedience, promised life upon the fulfilling, and threatened death upon the breach of it, and endued him with power and ability to keep it. Question 30. Doth God leave all mankind to perish in the estate of sin and misery? Answer. God doth not leave all men to perish in the estate of sin and misery, into which they fell by the breach of the first covenant, commonly called the covenant of works, but of his mere love and mercy delivereth his elect out of it, and bringeth them into an estate of salvation by the second covenant, commonly called the covenant of grace. The idea that any covenant God makes with man can be anything other than a covenant of grace is wrong, and deadly wrong. First, any covenant between God and man must be initiated and executed by God. It is thus an act of grace as well as of law. It requires works, but the works are the response of gratitude for the grace of law, for the grace of God's covenant. No covenant between God and man can sidestep the fact that there is a radical difference between the two parties. Indeed, man is totally God's creation and creature. He can make no claim on God. A covenant between equals, or relative equals, is mutually entered into. There are benefits to both parties. It is a covenant of love as well as of law and works. Marriage is such a covenant. It brings, in true marriage, advantages to both parties. In such a covenant, a dissolution is possible, hence the law of divorce. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. The mutuality of the covenant has been broken. Man, however, cannot terminate God's covenant. Man does not institute it, and hence man cannot terminate it. Man's works of law are a legal requirement of the covenant, not a condition of it. That is, the works do not make the covenant, but they are required by the covenant. God's grace requires the response of faith, obedience, love, works, and more. Thus, the works of law, that is, the obedience of faith, is a response, together with love, thanksgiving, and praise, to the covenant grace. The covenant or treaty between two parties, two nations, or a man and a wife, is not normally an act of grace. We do not marry someone because we are showing grace to them, although with Christians grace is present in their marriage, although not the reason for covenanting themselves to one another. We do not say, "Go to now, I will show grace to this man or woman by marrying him or her." The motive of God's covenant is grace. It is thus never a covenant of works. The law of that gracious covenant always requires works of us, but the covenant is an act of grace, and all the blessings thereof are grace. Second, this covenant of grace, because it is entirely made on God's initiative and before man's very existence. Acts chapter 15 verse 18 is an act of predestination. Every aspect of the covenant, man's fall, reprobation and redemption, is a part of God's eternal decree. To make the covenant at any time a covenant of works is to undermine God's sovereignty and predestination. The key text used by the Westminster Assembly to present this concept of a covenant of works was Galatians chapter 3 verse 12. And the law is not of faith, but the man that doeth them shall live in them. Paul here cites Leviticus chapter 18 verse 5. Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. I am the Lord. But this text is addressed to God's covenant people, his chosen people, the elect of grace. It is prefaced with the words, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, I am the Lord your God. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 2. The covenant name Lord, Jehovah or Yahweh is used. The Lord declares to Israel, I am your God, that is, your covenant God. They are told in Leviticus chapter 26, verses 1 to 46, and Deuteronomy chapter 28, that God's blessing and curses follow obedience and disobedience. To live in terms of blessing and curses is very different than living in terms of works. As workers, we are paid for our works. God blesses and rewards, or he curses, a very different kind of thing than a salary. It is absurd and morally wrong to equate this aspect of God's covenant with works. Third, the confession, in speaking of the covenant of works, says that man, by his fall, having made himself incapable of life by that covenant, the Lord gave him a second covenant, a covenant of grace. Chapters 7, 3. This is, again, a serious error. Man's incapacity in relationship to God did not come into being through the fall, neither in the state of innocence, nor the fall, nor of grace, nor of glory does man have any capacity to render anything to God in the way of works or accrued benefits. Moreover, the life of Adam and Eve in Eden was God's grace, not a product of their obedience prior to the fall. We too often overlook a key phrase in 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 7, the grace of life. Life itself is a gift of God's grace, whether to the redeemed or to the reprobate. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 5 and Galatians chapter 3 verse 12 tell us that when we walk in terms of covenant faithfulness, we are spared God's judgment and we receive God's blessings. If we do not obey the Lord, the very fact of life, a gift of grace, becomes for us a curse. Fourth, Galatians chapter 3 verse 12 tells us, the man that doeth them shall live in them, not by them. Sanday's comment is to the point. His life shall spring out of them and be nourished by them, just as a tree strikes its roots into the earth. It is a serious error to detach God's law, justice, judgment, or any other attribute from him, and to naturalize them. Blessings and curses are not like gravity or karma, with a natural and automatic consequence. In the, quote, natural, end quote, world, we can utilize one set of principles to, quote, get around, end quote, another set. Thus, gravity is not set aside by air flight, but gravity does not prevent air flight. In relationship to God, nothing man can do can circumnavigate blessings and curses. Only God, whose government is total, can alter his relationship to us, and it is all of grace, and in his wisdom, judgment, and mercy. Having said all this, it must now be added, in defence of the Westminster divines, that they never intended the covenant of works to be seen as a covenant of merit. However, in view of the common Protestant hostility to Rome for its ostensible doctrine of works, any talk of a covenant of works carried a like connotation. Both Rome and Westminster could justly plead that their doctrine did not assert a salvation by works, but both could be justly charged with opening the door to such a concept, although Westminster limited it to the time of Eden. The term covenant of works was also thought of as a covenant of nature. The rising philosophies of science were beginning to see nature as a kind of semi-independent realm from God. The indications of deism were very early present. They continue to the present in current ideas of, quote, nature, end quote, which is simply a collective noun for God's creation. It is not an independent entity. Thus, a concept of a covenant of works, or nature, detaches the covenant from God's sovereign grace and law. Thus, Adam's, quote, breach, end quote, of the covenant was not a breach of a covenant of works or nature, but a breach of God's grace. It was a personal affront and revolt against the grace of the person of God. Adam and Eve were confronted by the person of God, Genesis chapter 3, verses 8 to 9, and the judgment pronounced against them was specific and personal, Genesis chapter 3, verses 16 to 24. What we call, quote, natural law, end quote, is not personal. If I put my hand accidentally or intentionally into fire or against red-hot steel, I am burned. And it makes no difference whether I am male or female, old or young, or believer or non-believer. God's curse for the violation of His covenants is personal and specific. It affects all creation and all men, but each in a different way. The curse on Eve is not the same as that upon Adam. They suffer alike from sin and death, but within that framework, specific differences occur. The judgment is particular and personal. The covenant is always and only instituted by God's grace. It always is a covenant of law, because covenants are a form of law, and therefore it always requires works. This, however, does not make it a covenant of works.